It was a typical day aboard a luxurious private flight. But for Sarah, the head flight attendant, this day was about to take an unexpected turn. She had been in this job for years, serving a range of passengers, from the everyday traveler to high-profile billionaires. The airline was known for providing excellent service, and Sarah was proud of her role in making sure everything ran smoothly. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. As the passengers settled into their plush seats, Sarah went about her usual tasks, offering drinks, snacks, and ensuring everyone's comfort. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the plane's engines. There was an air of luxury in the atmosphere, and Sarah knew she had to maintain her calm and professional demeanor. In the middle of preparing the cabin, Sarah noticed a man sitting in the first-class section who stood out among the other passengers. He was tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit that screamed wealth and confidence. His name was Marcus Blackwell, though Sarah didn't know it yet. He was a well-known businessman, self-made, and had built a fortune in multiple industries. Marcus was known for his sharp mind and strong presence, someone who didn't tolerate mistakes, especially when it came to service. His reputation preceded him, though he wasn't a regular in the world of private flights. Despite his calm appearance, there was something about him that made Sarah feel uneasy. She could tell he was the type of person who expected perfection, and her job was to make sure that's exactly what he got. She had dealt with demanding customers before, but something about Marcus felt different. Sarah approached Marcus with a friendly smile, offering him a drink. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like something to drink? We have coffee, juice, or sparkling water," she asked politely, keeping her tone calm and professional. Marcus looked up at her with piercing eyes, taking in her every movement. "Just water," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that made Sarah feel like she was walking on thin ice. She nodded and quickly moved to get the drink, making sure to prepare it exactly as he requested. As Sarah returned to Marcus's seat, she noticed his eyes following her every step, which made her nervous. She handed him the water, but before she could walk away, Marcus spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I expect better service than this. I didn't ask for water in a plastic cup." Sarah froze for a moment. She had already served drinks to other passengers in glass cups, but she hadn't realized that Marcus would prefer the same. She quickly apologized and promised to fix it, her face slightly flushed. But she could tell this wasn't going to be an easy day. As the plane cruised through the sky, Sarah tried to focus on the other passengers and keep everything in order. But Marcus's eyes kept following her, his gaze making her feel more and more uncomfortable. She could sense the pressure building, but she also knew that as the head flight attendant, she had to keep her composure. The tension in the air grew with each interaction. She was used to handling demanding clients, but Marcus's presence seemed to carry a weight that made everything feel more intense. And as the flight continued, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something would soon go wrong. As the hours passed on the flight, the tension between Sarah and Marcus continued to grow. The cabin was quiet, but Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze on her whenever she walked by. She had served countless high-profile passengers in the past, but there was something about Marcus that made her feel uneasy. His every word seemed measured, his tone colder than she was used to. She had learned over the years that people in his position often had high expectations, but Marcus felt different. Sarah knew she couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. She tried to focus on the other passengers, making sure everyone else had everything they needed. But Marcus kept pulling her attention back to him. Every time she passed by his seat, he seemed to find something to criticize. The drinks weren't chilled enough, the snacks weren't fresh enough, and the service wasn't quick enough. It wasn't that Sarah wasn't doing her best. It was that Marcus expected perfection, and in his eyes, she just wasn't measuring up. At first, Sarah tried to stay calm, smiling through his remarks and keeping her tone friendly. But as the minutes turned into hours, her patience began to wear thin. The demands kept coming, each one more critical than the last. And no matter what she did, it felt like she couldn't make him happy. Her hand started to shake slightly, and her mind raced as she tried to keep everything in order. She had been on countless flights, had met all kinds of people, but this was different. Marcus's presence seemed to fill the cabin, and every time she approached him, she felt a growing sense of dread. Was she doing something wrong? Was she not good enough? The other passengers seemed to notice the change in the air too. Some of them exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer the calm, relaxed vibe it had been when the flight began. It was now filled with an uncomfortable sense of tension. As Sarah returned to Marcus's seat to check on him again, she could feel her heart racing. She had made sure his drink was just the way he wanted it, and she was ready to apologize for any mistake she might have made. But Marcus was already waiting for her, his sharp eyes following her every move. Finally, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Sarah took a deep breath and smiled again. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Blackwell?" Marcus didn't even look at her as he responded. "I'd like a fresh cup of coffee, not the watered-down version you gave me earlier. And make sure it's served in a proper mug, not one of those cheap disposable cups." Sarah's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. She had been doing this for a long time, and she knew that dealing with difficult passengers was part of the job. But something about Marcus's tone made it harder than usual to keep her cool. She nodded quickly and turned to leave, but as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The pressure was building. The flight was supposed to be an escape, a moment of peace for the passengers, but for Sarah, it was starting to feel like a battle. She couldn't let her guard down, not for a second. She had to keep everything under control. Little did Sarah know, her patience was about to be tested in ways she couldn't have imagined. The flight was now well into its journey, and Sarah could feel the tension building with each passing minute. The cabin was still quiet, but inside, Sarah's nerves were on edge. Marcus was seated in first class, but it felt like he was everywhere. His complaints kept coming, each one more critical than the last, and Sarah's patience was running thin. She had always been professional, always put on a smile, no matter how difficult the passengers were, but Marcus was different. He didn't just criticize the service. He seemed to be looking for mistakes, ready to pounce on anything that wasn't perfect. As Sarah moved through the cabin, handing out drinks and checking in with the other passengers, she could feel Marcus's eyes following her every move. His gaze was intense, and no matter what she did, it felt like it was never enough. The small mistakes she had made early on were beginning to weigh on her. She tried to focus on the other passengers, but it was hard not to feel the pressure. She couldn't afford to mess up again. Then it happened. Sarah had just finished serving a few other passengers when she walked past Marcus's seat again. This time, she could feel his eyes on her even before she got close. He was looking at his drink, which Sarah had already corrected once. She had made sure it was just the way he wanted it, but it wasn't good enough. Without saying a word, Marcus waved her over. "Come here," he said coldly, not even bothering to look up at her. His voice was sharp, and it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She felt her heart race as she walked over to him, already knowing what was coming. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He finally looked at her, his gaze colder than before. "This drink is still not right," he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "I asked for it to be perfect. It's far from it. Do you understand?" Sarah's face turned red. She had tried so hard to meet his expectations, but it seemed that nothing would ever be enough. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could say anything, Marcus cut her off. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can just serve me anything and I'll be fine with it." He stood up slightly in his seat, looking down at her. "I'm not like the other passengers. I expect better treatment. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be here." The words hit Sarah hard. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she just stood there, frozen. She had been a flight attendant for years, But this was the first time she felt completely powerless in front of a passenger. Marcus's words felt like a slap in the face. She had never been spoken to like this before. She had never felt so small. But in that moment, something inside Sarah snapped. She had been trying so hard to keep everything perfect, to meet his impossible standards, and she had reached her limit. Without thinking, Sarah raised her hand and slapped Marcus. It wasn't a hard slap, but it was enough to make a loud sound that echoed through the quiet cabin. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Passengers turned to look, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Sarah's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she had just done. She had never, ever acted like this before. But in that moment of anger and frustration, she couldn't stop herself. For a second, there was silence. Then, Marcus slowly turned his head to face her, his eyes widening in surprise. Sarah stood there, her hand still raised, her heart pounding in her chest. The cabin was silent, the air thick with shock. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still hanging in the air after the slap. She could hardly believe what she had just done. Her heart raced, and her breath felt short in her chest. The slap had been a knee-jerk reaction to the pressure, frustration, and anger that had built up over the past few hours. But now, as she stood there, she realized the enormity of her mistake. The passengers around her had all turned in their seats, their eyes wide with disbelief. The moment seemed to stretch out forever. Sarah's mind was spinning, her body filled with dread. What had she done? How could she have lost control like that? This wasn't her. She had always prided herself on being professional, no matter how difficult the passengers were. But now, in the midst of the calm luxury of the flight, everything felt like it was falling apart. For a brief moment, Marcus didn't move. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with something much darker, something cold and piercing. Sarah couldn't read his expression, but she could sense the danger in his silence. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, and her body trembled. Then, slowly, Marcus stood up. He didn't shout or yell. Instead, he just stood there, towering over Sarah. The calmness in his demeanor only made Sarah feel more anxious. What was he going to do? Would he demand that she be fired? Would he report her to the airline and ruin her career? I should have known better. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but clear. His words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. He wasn't angry, not in the way she had expected. There was no yelling, no rage. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, an eerie calm that made Sarah feel even more guilty. The passengers remained silent, watching the exchange unfold in front of them. Sarah's hand shook as she clasped them in front of her, trying to steady herself. She couldn't look at Marcus. She was ashamed, embarrassed. She had messed up, and she didn't know how to fix it. "Mr. Blackwell," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." She trailed off, unable to find the right words. She had no excuse for what had happened, no way to explain why she had lost control. She had simply snapped. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath. Was this the end of her career? Was he going to make her pay for this mistake? To her surprise, Marcus didn't react the way she had feared. He didn't shout, didn't demand anything. Instead, he sighed deeply, as if he were weighing the situation in his mind. The silence between them stretched out, each second feeling longer than the last. Then, in a voice that was almost too calm, he spoke again. "You've made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person," he said slowly. "I've seen worse, much worse." Sarah blinked, trying to process his words. Was he letting her off the hook? Was this some sort of test? She didn't know how to respond, and she felt like a fool for having even thought that this would be easy. He didn't wait for her to answer. Instead, he turned to the rest of the cabin, addressing the passengers. "I'm fine," he said, his tone cool but polite. "There's no need for any drama. Let's just get back to the flight." The passengers seemed to relax a little, but Sarah remained on edge. She wasn't sure what to make of Marcus's response. Was he angry, but just hiding it? Or was he truly unaffected by the incident? She didn't know. But one thing was clear: this moment wasn't over. And she had no idea how it was going to play out. The flight continued without further interruption, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was far from calm. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered after the slap. Every time she glanced at Marcus, she saw the same calm, collected expression on his face, but something in his eyes told her there was more to the situation than she understood. Despite the tension, Sarah tried to keep her focus on her duties. She walked up and down the aisles, serving drinks, checking on the other passengers, and doing everything she could to keep things running smoothly. But all the while, her thoughts kept returning to Marcus. Was he angry? Was he going to do something to ruin her career? She had no idea what to expect. She had never been in a situation like this before. Most passengers, no matter how difficult, didn't leave her feeling so shaken. But Marcus was different. There was an air of power around him that Sarah couldn't ignore. She tried to keep her mind off the situation, but the tension was unbearable. It felt like the weight of the entire flight was on her shoulders. She could tell that other passengers were curious about what had happened, but no one dared to speak. They seemed to sense the seriousness of the moment and knew better than to get involved. It wasn't until much later in the flight that Sarah finally learned who Marcus really was. She had just finished checking on a few other passengers when she heard his voice again, calling her over in the same calm tone he had used earlier. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady. "Come here for a moment." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She was already dreading what he was going to say. Was he going to demand that she be fired? Would she be facing legal action for her actions? She wasn't sure she could handle it. But she walked over to him anyway, doing her best to keep her composure. When she reached him, Marcus didn't immediately speak. He just looked at her, as if he were sizing her up. Sarah waited, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. Sarah blinked, confused. "You're Mr. Blackwell, of course," she said, trying to sound polite. She didn't understand where this was going. Marcus gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, that's true. But do you know who I am?" he asked again, his voice carrying a weight that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Before she could answer, Marcus stood up, his tall frame imposing as he moved past her. "I own this airline," he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Sarah's eyes widened as the realization hit her like a thunderclap. This man, this billionaire whom she had slapped in a moment of frustration, was the owner of the airline she worked for. For a moment, Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet shift. She had no idea what to say. What could she say? The man she had just humiliated had more power than she could possibly comprehend. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, and her stomach churned with fear. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, as if he had expected this reaction. "Most people don't," he said simply. "But now you do. And I'd appreciate it if you would remember that going forward." Sarah felt her heart race as she tried to make sense of everything. The slap, the tension, the realization that Marcus was the owner of the airline. It was all so overwhelming. She had never been more aware of her own vulnerability. But instead of becoming angry or demanding anything from her, Marcus simply sat back down, his gaze softening for the first time since the incident. "Don't worry," he said, his tone shifting to one that was almost kind. "I'm not going to make this a bigger issue than it needs to be." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She was still in shock, still trying to wrap her mind around the fact that the man she had just clashed with was not just any passenger. He was the one in charge of everything. As the flight continued, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She had no idea what Marcus's next move would be. But one thing was clear. The dynamics of this flight had completely shifted. After Marcus revealed who he really was, Sarah didn't know how to feel. The rest of the flight went by in a blur. Her mind kept racing, replaying the moment she had slapped him. She couldn't believe she had done something so reckless. But the most unsettling part was that she still didn't know what would happen next. Would Marcus make her pay for what she'd done? Would he demand her firing, or even worse, take legal action? She tried to stay focused on her duties, but it was hard. Every time she walked past Marcus, her heart would race. He had sat back down after their conversation, but the tension between them hadn't gone away. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the power he held, not just in the airline, but in the entire industry. He had every right to destroy her career if he wanted to. The thought of that made her stomach churn. As the flight continued, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the weight of the situation was growing heavier. She had to face the man who owned the airline, a man who she had humiliated in front of everyone on board. How could she possibly make things right? The rest of the passengers seemed to have forgotten about the incident, or at least they weren't talking about it. Sarah noticed a few of them exchanging glances, but no one brought it up. They had their own lives to focus on, their own journeys. But for Sarah, this flight felt like an endless, heavy weight pressing down on her. She kept wondering how she would explain this mess when she got back home, and if she'd even have a job to go back to. It wasn't long before Marcus called her over again. She had just finished serving drinks to a few other passengers when she heard his voice. "Sarah," he said, and the simple mention of her name sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know what to expect this time, but she didn't want to disappoint him further. She took a deep breath and walked over, trying to look calm even though she was far from it. When she reached him, Marcus didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her for a few seconds, as if weighing something in his mind. Sarah stood there, waiting, trying not to let her nervousness show. "Look," Marcus finally said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I'm not going to make this into a big issue." Sarah blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "You're not?" she asked, surprised by his calm response. Marcus shook his head slightly. "No, I think we've both had a rough time today. But we don't need to make it worse." He paused, watching her closely. "I understand what it's like to be under pressure. I know it's not easy." Sarah felt a mix of relief and confusion. Was this really happening? Was he actually going to let this go? After everything that had happened, she couldn't believe it. Her mind raced as she tried to process his words. "I appreciate your understanding, Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly, her voice still a little shaky. "I really didn't mean to upset you. I got frustrated." Marcus nodded, and for the first time, he gave her a small smile. It wasn't a big, welcoming grin, but it was enough to make Sarah feel like she wasn't completely in trouble. "I get it," he said. "Just do your best, and we'll be fine." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't know why Marcus was being so generous, but she was grateful. She had been so afraid that her mistake would cost her everything, but now, it seemed like he wasn't going to take any further action. Still, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. She had no idea what Marcus might be thinking, and for all she knew, he could change his mind at any moment. But for now, she had been given a chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. As she walked away, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders lighten a little. The rest of the flight seemed to pass in a blur, but at least the worst of it was over. For now, anyway. The flight continued on, and for the most part, Sarah did her best to put the awkward situation behind her. After Marcus's unexpected response, she felt a bit lighter. He hadn't made a scene, hadn't demanded her dismissal, and hadn't tried to make her life miserable. For that, she was grateful. However, something about the way he had looked at her during their conversation stuck with her. There was still a lingering tension, and she couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. As the flight progressed, Sarah tried to maintain her professionalism. She served the other passengers, checked on their needs, and made sure everything in the cabin was running smoothly. But every now and then, her eyes would drift toward Marcus, who seemed to be deep in thought, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if he were watching everything. It was during one of these moments that Sarah felt the atmosphere shift. She was walking down the aisle when Marcus called her name again. The tone in his voice was different this time. Stronger, more commanding. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Come here." Her heart skipped a beat. She had hoped the situation was behind them, but now it seemed like something else was coming. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him, her mind racing with questions. What did he want now? Had she done something wrong again? When she reached his seat, Marcus was already looking at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak. Sarah felt her palms begin to sweat, her nerves returning. She wasn't sure if he was angry or simply trying to figure out the best way to handle things. Either way, the air around him was heavy with authority. "I need to talk to you," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "I've been thinking about this entire situation. I don't want you to think this is over." Sarah's heart dropped. What did he mean by that? She had hoped things were going to settle down, but now it seemed like Marcus wasn't finished with her just yet. "I'm listening, Mr. Blackwell," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice even, but she could feel the tension creeping back into her chest. Marcus leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. He looked up at her for a moment, his eyes piercing. "You slapped me," he said slowly. "And that's not something I take lightly. But I'm not going to react the way you might expect." Sarah swallowed hard. What did that mean? Was he planning to retaliate in some way? The uncertainty of the situation made her stomach twist with anxiety. She was just trying to do her job, but every time she thought it was going to be okay, something else seemed to come up. "I don't want you to think I'm just letting this slide," Marcus continued. "But I also don't want you to think I'm going to destroy your career over a mistake. What happened was unfortunate, but I understand that people make mistakes." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It seemed like Marcus wasn't going to cause her any immediate harm, but the uncertainty in his tone still made her nervous. She wasn't sure if he was trying to intimidate her or genuinely offering some sort of understanding. "So, what happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice a little softer than she intended. Marcus paused before answering, his gaze not leaving hers. "Now we move on. But understand this. You've made an impression on me, and I'll be watching you closely from now on." Sarah nodded, trying to process what he was saying. She wasn't sure if he was being serious or if he was just trying to keep control over the situation. Either way, the weight of his words lingered in the air between them. He gave a slight nod, as if signaling the end of the conversation. "You're not fired, but you need to remember who you're dealing with next time." With that, Marcus leaned back in his seat, turning his attention back to the window. The conversation was over, but Sarah felt like the tension still hung in the air. She turned to walk away, but she couldn't help but feel that everything had changed. She had crossed a line, and now she wasn't sure what the future held. After Marcus's last conversation with Sarah, the rest of the flight passed in a strange calm. The tension was still there, but it wasn't as thick as before. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had never felt so unsure of herself on a flight. Every step she took seemed to be under a microscope, especially whenever she had to pass Marcus. He was still the same quiet, intense figure he had been from the start. The only difference now was that she knew exactly who he was, and that knowledge made her feel even more nervous. As the flight began its descent, Sarah tried to focus on wrapping up her tasks. She cleared empty cups and trays, made sure everyone had their seatbelts fastened, and checked in on the remaining passengers. She was trying her best to ignore the sense of anxiety that still gripped her chest. But Marcus wasn't making it easy. Despite his calm, his presence still loomed over her. Every time she walked by him, she felt his eyes on her, as if he were watching every move she made. She couldn't decide if it was his way of reminding her of who he was, or if he was simply observing. Either way, it made her uneasy. As the plane finally touched down, the cabin began to prepare for landing. The usual bustle filled the air as the flight attendants checked that everything was in order. Sarah had one final task: helping passengers disembark, and making sure they were satisfied before leaving the plane. When it was time for the passengers to leave, Marcus was one of the first to stand up. Sarah braced herself, not sure if he was going to say anything to her before he left. Would he mention the incident again? Would he acknowledge the tension between them? To her surprise, Marcus simply walked toward the exit, but before he reached the door, he turned to Sarah. He looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring her one last time. She stood still, waiting for whatever would come next. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "You did your job today. It wasn't perfect, but I can see you tried your best. That counts for something." Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Was this really happening? Was Marcus Blackwell, the man she had slapped earlier, actually complimenting her? "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice still a little shaky. She wasn't sure what else to say, but the small bit of praise was enough to make her feel a little better. He gave her a small nod, a gesture that felt almost like a form of closure. "I won't forget this," he said simply, but his tone was softer than before. "But I'm not going to hold it against you." And with that, he turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of passengers as they made their way off the plane. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart still racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. What started as a mistake, a moment of frustration, had turned into something completely unexpected. She had feared the worst, losing her job, facing consequences that could ruin her career. But instead, Marcus had handled it with surprising understanding. As the last of the passengers left, Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight on her shoulders lift. The flight was finally over. She had survived, and more than that, she had learned something important. She learned that even in the most stressful situations, there was always room for growth. She had made a mistake, but she had also been given a chance to make things right. The plane was empty now, and Sarah took one last look around before she walked off the plane. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time that day, she felt like maybe she could face whatever came next. The plane had landed, and Sarah stepped off it with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The day had been a roller coaster, with moments of fear, regret, and unexpected understanding. As she walked down the airport hallway, she couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind. The slap, the tension, and then Marcus's surprising words. It all felt like a blur, but it had changed her in ways she wasn't sure she fully understood yet. As she made her way to the employee lounge to debrief with her fellow flight attendants, Sarah tried to clear her mind. She wasn't sure how to explain everything that had happened, but she didn't feel like she needed to. The situation had been unique, and it wasn't something most people would understand. All she knew was that it had been a defining moment in her career. Her fellow attendants noticed her tense posture and asked if everything was okay. Sarah just nodded and said she was fine. She didn't want to talk about it just yet. What had happened was personal, and she needed some time to process it on her own. The events of the day had brought her face to face with something she hadn't expected: the unpredictability of human behavior. It wasn't just about service. It was about handling the pressure and learning from mistakes. The rest of the crew tried to make small talk, but Sarah couldn't focus on anything but what had just transpired. She couldn't help but wonder if Marcus would ever cross her path again. Would he remember her? Would he mention the incident to anyone else? She had no idea. But one thing was for sure. He had seen something in her. Maybe it was just his way of handling the situation, or maybe it was his belief that people could grow from their mistakes. Either way, Sarah felt a shift inside her. For the first time, she felt like she had faced something difficult and come out the other side stronger. Later that evening, Sarah received a call from her supervisor. She braced herself, unsure of what was coming. Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? "Sarah," her supervisor said, "I just wanted to check in with you after the flight today. I heard there was an incident with a passenger, but I also heard that you handled the situation with grace in the end. I want to let you know that we're not taking any action." You've been with us for a long time, and we know you're a dedicated flight attendant." The relief that washed over Sarah was overwhelming. She hadn't known what to expect, but hearing that the airline wasn't going to take action against her was a huge weight off her shoulders. She had feared the worst, but instead, she had been given a chance to prove herself. "Thank you so much," Sarah replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I won't let this happen again. I've learned a lot from this experience." As the days went by, Sarah felt like she was growing from the experience. She knew she had made a mistake, but she also knew she wasn't defined by it. People made mistakes all the time. It was how they handled those mistakes that truly mattered. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. And as for Marcus, Sarah never saw him again, but she would always remember the way he handled the situation. His calm, his understanding, and the way he showed her that mistakes didn't have to be the end of the road. They could be the beginning of something better. The story of the flight attendant who slapped the billionaire would always be a part of her, but it wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning.